BioShock Infinite is the long-awaited spiritual successor slash prequel to BioShock 1 and 2. It was released worldwide on March 26, 2013 on Windows, PlayStation 3, and Xbox 360. This release date came after a few delays. Initially, the game was announced in October 2012 to be released in March 2012. Then in May 2012, the release date was pushed back again to February 2013. Finally, the game in December 2012 was pushed back one final time to its release date in March 2013. Irrational Games noted that they had been working on BioShock Infinite since they had finished work on the original BioShock. So did this long development time of 5+ years hurt or help the final product? This is what the main focus of this review will be. Is BioShock Infinite as good a game as it could have been? What elements of the game can we glean were cut from the game based on early gameplay footage and interviews with the developers? And if these components were left in the game, would it have helped or hindered the final product? Also, how does Infinite stand when compared to its predecessor BioShock 1? Let's find out. BioShock Infinite begins with a man named Booker DeWitt being given a mission to retrieve an unknown girl from her captors and bring her to New York in order to clear his debts to another unknown individual. Much like the beginning of BioShock 1, Infinite begins with the player character outside of a lighthouse, this time just off the coast of Maine instead of the middle of the Atlantic. The lighthouse takes the player character to the floating city of Columbia, where we see one of the greatest strengths of the game, its aesthetically pleasing art style. The game presents itself at first almost like a Disney movie. The ambience of the setting of course changes over the duration of the game, but the art style suits it. It's a darker Disney fairy tale conceived for an older audience. It even comes with your own damsel locked in a tower. One of the major allures of the original BioShock was the isolation you felt as you traveled the world of Rapture. Columbia, though, is meant to feel like a vibrant and lively city. However, like other games of today, the technology isn't there yet to allow the number of NPCs present to truly convey the feeling of a bustling metropolis. And in such locations as the fairground at the beginning, the city streets feel close to empty, yet the player character does not feel alone. A pretty disappointing middle ground to hit. This continues in the later points of the game once the Vox are in all-out war with the city's police force, as the scale of the battles do not feel as grand as they should be if a city the size of Columbia was an open revolt. Graphically, the game is a small step forward from its predecessor, with BioShock Infinite being developed on the Unreal Engine 3, while BioShock 1 was developed on the Unreal Engine 2.5. The game manages to trick the player very well into thinking it is a large step forward graphically, with ample use of the Unreal Engine 3's additions of high dynamic range lighting, per pixel lighting, and dynamic shadows. These additions benefit the environment of Columbia well, as when compared to Rapture, it is a much more open and bright environment, and these technological advancements truly help bring about the message that Columbia is meant to be a holy city floating above the clouds. The combat in this game is a mixed bag. The ability to use Vigors while keeping your main weapon out is a major plus over the original BioShock, where you had to decide between one and the other. However, they counter this with the newly added decision to only allow the player character to hold 2 weapons. This is an issue due to the fact that many of the weapons are incredibly circumstantial. The worst offenders are guns such as the volley gun or hailfire, which are only good against grouped up enemies or larger foes, and the heater or shotgun, which are only effective against enemies who are close to you. It is hard to voluntarily choose to use many weapons when other ones such as the carbine or the machine guns tend to work well in all combat situations. The Skyhook was the biggest letdown when it came to combat in BioShock Infinite. While fun and fast-paced in theory, the environments in which most of the larger battles took place either had no sky rails to be found, or in the few occasions where they did exist, were nothing more than a circle added to allow you to quickly escape or gain distance from an enemy. I'll go into more detail about this later when I discuss aspects of the game that seem to be cut based on early gameplay footage. Combat can get a little stale as well during the middle section of the game, once the beauty of Columbia has worn off. There's a very small amount of enemy variety throughout the entire game. In standard combat situations, you will only see normal enemies, elite enemies armed with shotguns or RPGs, firemen, zealots, and motorized patriots. There are a handful of special enemies such as the Boys of Silence and the Handymen, however they are so few and far between that they feel more like boss battles than special standard enemy fodder. Regarding the Handymen, it is obvious that they are supposed to be the big daddies of the Infinite universe, and they share a few attributes. They are resilient, strong, and much more intimidating than almost anything else in the game. Big daddies from the original included. However, they are not optional. Unlike the big daddies of BioShock 1, handymen are thrown at you as unavoidable enemies at certain times during the game. The handyman's design in and of themselves is fine, and also fits nicely into the theme that Columbia routinely steals tech from the future and reappropriates it for its own use. Big daddies become handymen, Rapture becomes Columbia, Girls Just Want to Have Fun becomes a carnival tune, Beach Boy tracks become barbershop quartet songs, and etc. However, the problem with the handymen come from the unavoidable difficulty spike that they bring. The majority of BioShock Infinite on any difficulty level, besides 1999 mode, which I haven't played yet, is a relatively mild game in terms of difficulty. One of its flaws is that it ramps up the difficulty in certain spots, such as the 3 fights with Lady Comstock, any fight with a handyman, and the big shootout on Comstock Zeppelin. There is also the instance towards the end of the game where it shifts gears from an action FPS into a stealth game during the chapter in the jail. To be clear, difficulty is not innately bad and can add much challenge and reward to the game. It is unacceptable in many's opinion, though, when a game has an average difficulty level and then suddenly ramps it up to a state where the player feels like they are being treated unfairly, or the genre of the game suddenly changes for the same effect. A steadily increasing difficulty curve is important to a game, as it rewards the player for becoming more intimate with the game's mechanics, and is key to making the player feel as if they have made it through some hardships to reach the end credits, and learn something in the process. But when the curve is more of a mountain range as opposed to a steady incline, it could turn off players, take them out of the experience, and frustrate them into quitting the game. The sporadic difficulty curves can be rationalized away, as there is no penalty for death in Infinite. When dying, you and the enemies you are facing receive a portion of their health back, and the player character loses a small amount of money. Once you run out of money, however, this negative goes away. In 1999 mode, once you lose all of your money, you are sent back to the main menu and must restart from your last checkpoint. So in the 3 normal difficulty modes, there is almost no penalty for death, even though your chances of dying outside the times mentioned before are slim to none. So some people will dismiss the erratic difficulty of the game by saying the lack of punishment for death makes it okay. However, I do not feel that anything makes up for an aspect of the game that detracts from the overall enjoyment of it, when it was something that the developers should have seen in quality assurance. If it was a conscionable choice of the developers to have such a desultory difficulty, I do not see what they were trying to achieve with it. But with the level of polish that obviously went into many aspects of the game, it is hard for me to believe that this was something they simply overlooked. The lack of a punishment for dying is also accompanied by a lack of a punishment for theft as well. Numerous times during the game you are given the option to steal from either people or storefronts. On my first playthrough, thinking that like previous BioShock games there would be multiple endings and that the ending you received depended on how well you handled yourself throughout the game, I declined to steal anything, or kill any person who did not aggro immediately upon seeing me. However, this is not the case, as any objects you steal or innocents you kill have no effect whatsoever upon the ending you receive. This can be seen as a negative. On the other hand, it would seem to fit the theme of the game that no matter what decisions you make during the narrative, your ultimate outcome would be the same. This was most likely a deliberate choice made by Irrational Games. To remove the multiple ending feature of the previous games allowed the ending to hit harder and have a better impact once you get to the end. And having BioShock Infinite with its narrative have multiple endings would only muddle its message. On the same note, it is worth mentioning that early in the game, it presents you with a message stating that it is not always the best option to go careening into every area guns a-blazing, and that sometimes it is best to keep your gun holstered. This seems to be an aspect of the game that was scrapped at some point, and that Irrational originally intended to have non-aggressive NPCs that do not realize who you are until you do something to alert them, and that you would also have the option to interact with in non-violent contextual circumstances, much like at the onset of the game before the raffle. This can be ascertained from the fact that they give you this prompt at one of the early points in the game during the tutorial levels, and that for the rest of the game, every police officer, and at later points, after you've made yourself an enemy of the Vox Populi soldiers would start firing as soon as they saw you, with or without provocation. But more on this later. The game does provide a moderate amount of replay value for those who are interested. The multiple difficulty modes, including the unlockable 1999 mode, which offers further challenge than hard, can make a second playthrough more enjoyable. The availability of a chapter select function also allows the player to only play select portions of the game that they found the most fun, or feel that they might have missed a bit of the story during. A staple of the Shock series of games, discoverable audio logs, in this game known as voxophones, provide much more insight into the history of Columbia, its important people, and of the game itself. The chapter selection works well in tandem with the voxophones, and for the hardcore fans of BioShock Infinite, the chapter selection makes it very easy to backtrack and find and hear all of these for yourself. BioShock Infinite is a single-player experience, and most likely due to the polish put into that, it does not have a multiplayer aspect as of yet. But it is being rumored that one of the 3 DLC announced for the game will be some kind of multiplayer. This, however, is far from a negative for me because in the current state of the industry, I feel there is a severe lack of games with a solely single-player focus. The music in Infinite is an asset to the game. The dynamic combat music adds a sense of originality to every combat situation. The music swells at the beginning of every encounter and falls at each conclusion, adding a nice punctuation point to the end of each battle. The subplot of Colombian inventors stealing tech and music from the future also allowed Irrational to take liberties with the soundtrack at certain locations, such as the use of songs by the Beach Boys, Cyndi Lauper, and CCR in ways you wouldn't think possible. Another strong point for the music in this game is Mozart's Lacrimosa. First heard in Lady Comstock's Memorial, later if you listen closely during the Lady Comstock encounters, a distorted version of the same track is wailed, bolstering the eerie and supernatural feeling to the encounter. And once again, close to Elizabeth's statue in Comstock House, another distorted version of the track is playing from a phonograph, wordlessly conveying the connection in Comstock's eyes between Lady Comstock and Elizabeth to the player. Now on to the last 2 topics, the first being a few aspects Infinite takes steps backwards from its predecessor, the second being ways Infinite seemed to take steps backwards from earlier versions of itself. Now, as I stated before and will quickly repeat, the overall implementation of the handymen when compared to the Big Daddies was done in a much more ham-fisted and frustrating way. The ability to use Vigors and your weapons simultaneously is a much appreciated upgrade from the original BioShock, but something that was already in BioShock 2. However, in my gameplay experience, I noted that Vigors were significantly weaker than the plasmids of BioShock 1. This is partly due to the fact that you have a far smaller supply of salts than you ever did of Eve, leading to a rationing of your salts and less opportunity to experiment with them, and also due to the fact that your guns do far more damage than Vigors do, turning Vigors into nothing more than a form of crowd control. Offensive plasmids in BioShock 1, such as Incinerate, could be used as an alternative to weapon fire for damage to enemy NPCs, because they could rival your weapons in terms of damage output, especially with the proper gene tonics equipped. Vigors in Infinite are far too weak and costly to be used outside of extraordinary circumstances for offense, and are mainly used to keep certain enemies distracted or to control certain dangerous enemies for a certain period of time. It is also worth mentioning that there are only 8 Vigors in Infinite compared to 11, 12 if you count the one to save the Little Sisters, in BioShock 1. A pleasing change from BioShock 1 was the removal of the hacking system. While the first few times you encountered the hacking puzzles in BioShock 1 were impressive, they quickly lost their appeal and became nothing more than tedious obstacles in your way towards progressing forwards. Of course, a number of these puzzles were avoidable, but more often than not, they made your gameplay experience easier by putting up with them, either by disabling security, converting enemy turrets into friendly ones, or unlocking areas with ammo and other goodies. One of the largest aspects cut from the original game was any form of a crafting system. In BioShock 1, the player character Jack was able to use many of the random items they found around Rapture at locations called U-Invents to create many different items such as specialized ammunition, gene tonics, which in Infinite are replaced by gear, and other random pieces of loot such as hacking tools. In Infinite, this whole aspect is gone, as well as any form of alternate ammunition. My largest complaint with BioShock Infinite, though, comes from how linear the game is. The game, for the most part, is a beautifully masked corridor shooter. You're given an objective, and rest assured the way to reach said objective is just to move forward. The game keeps the navigational arrow from the original BioShock, where it was needed as BioShock 1 included larger worlds, hubs, offshoots, and backtracking. But in Infinite, this nav arrow is never needed outside of the mission where you're looking for the 3 tears to calm Lady Comstock, and even then, with a little searching, it is not hard to figure out where you need to go next without it. A linear game is not necessarily a negative, as a linear experience allows the developer to more accurately place set pieces for the player and more closely control the gameplay experience and how one experiences the story. But when a player enjoys a previous game in a series, and a later game changes one of the major gameplay elements, in this case, going from an open world experience to a more linear one, it could disappoint older fans of the series. I think a very poignant way to end this review is by taking a look at the 15 minutes of gameplay footage released in July of 2011 and see what changes have been made since then and if they were for the better or worse. It is important to note that even though all this footage was taken from in-game, that this was a handcrafted experience created by the developers to show the world, and that it would be naive to believe that the final product would ever be as intense as any pre-release gameplay footage. To begin, as I stated earlier, there seems to be a severe lack of non-aggressive NPCs who only attack based on what actions the player character makes.
Booker.
Listen, friend, we're not looking for any trouble.
Yeah.
Instead, what we saw in the final product was group after group of NPCs who would attack as soon as you were within their line of sight. The closest we get to this in the final product is in the few locations where stealing is an option. If you do take something that's text as a red color instead of white, you will cause an NPC to attack you. These scenarios are so few and far between that it makes one wonder if they did intend for there to be a morality system at one point. Elizabeth in this demo seems to have a deeper connection with her environment. She interacts with random objects and comments more on seemingly unimportant objects around the city. We get a version of this in the final product, but outside of cutscenes, Liz will do nothing more than speak a line.
Hello, Roscoe.
Hey, Booker.
87 years ago.
Keep looking, Lincoln.
The Vigor system used items in your inventory to power them, as opposed to a refillable mana bar. This change severely gimped the Vigor system. Lowering the power of the Vigors while simultaneously lowering the amount you can use them nerfed them almost to a point where they were no longer worth using. One or the other would have been fine, but not both. When looking at the combat in this demo, we can see that the skyhook sections actually mix combat with geographical progression. You can use the skyhooks to get from your starting position to the Zeppelin and back again while fighting for your life. This creates a sense of urgency while forcing the player character to keep moving, instead of just hiding behind cover and taking potshots, making the combat more dynamic and fun. We never saw anything like this in the finished product. Every combat situation was located within an arena, where you were unable to progress until everything was dead, and as I stated before, skyhooks were never used as a mode of necessary transportation outside of Comstock's Zeppelin, and only as a gimmick. Storyline-wise, it can be disorienting to notice certain quotes from the game being said in areas they were not in the final product.
Promise me.
I will stop him.
No. That is an oath you cannot keep. But promise me that if it comes to it, you will not let him take me back.
Also, Elizabeth states that they were going to Comstock for help, something that never happened in the release version. This begs the question, what happened that made them change the storyline so drastically? When was it changed, or how late in the development? And did this hurt the end product? There is no way to know for sure, as we will probably never see the build of the game this footage came from, but Irrational's Bill Gardner was quoted as saying enough content for 5 or 6 games was scrapped during BioShock Infinite's development. This could explain certain things missing noted before, such as the more advanced skyhook combat, dynamic enemy AI, an aggro system, and a morality system of some sort taking into consideration such things as theft and the killing of innocents. I've tried to stay as balanced as possible as I could in this review, making sure to note positive things in the game and negatives. I'm well aware I've focused more on the shortcomings of BioShock Infinite, but just to be sure I will make myself clear here. This is a fantastic game and a definite Game of the Year contender. I just believe that it could have been so much better with a few changes, and believe that certain reviewers are going a little far when they claim it is a masterpiece and the best gaming experience to date. The bottom line is Infinite is a fantastic game, and if you enjoyed it, good for you. Now if you haven't, go and play the original BioShock. It's a better experience and you're in for a treat.